Whether through its own hardware or through streaming services like Apple TV+, Apple very clearly wants to make its mark in your living room. But Apple has been there before, a long time ago actually, with a game console / internet appliance / bare bones Mac / utter failure. This is the story of Pippin. In 1993, after former CEO John Sculley's tumultuous tenure, Apple's board of directors asked Sculley for his resignation and installed Michael Spindler, formerly Apple's chief in Europe, to take over the whole thing. Spindler is a hell of a character, but the reason he's really important in this case is that he oversaw one of the biggest changes to Apple's approach to computing in the company's history. With a little over a year to go before he was fired, Spindler made the controversial call to license the Mac operating system to third-party hardware makers. All of a sudden, Apple's OS wasn't just for Apple computers anymore. Spindler hoped that if everything worked the way he wanted, he'd be looking at 1 million Mac clones sold by the end of the year. And I probably don't need to tell you that things did not work out that way. But that period of Apple history was transformative for a few reasons. One, it brought us this amazingly strange music video of a Tiffany song parody crafted by one of Apple's in-house marketing people that I've been trying to get into a video for years.
I think we're a clone now. There's always Michael Dell just hanging around. I think we're a clone now. The crash of Intel stock is the only sound.
More importantly though, it signaled a kind of new and desperate openness that leads us to the other half of the story, 5,000 miles away.
It's the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, teenage defenders of Earth.
Around the same time, Bandai, one of, if not the biggest toy company in Japan, was busy dealing with change of its own. Consoles like the Super Famicom, or the Super Nintendo, and Sega's Mega Drive, also known as the Genesis, they had already hit the scene, and they were shaping what home entertainment was all about in the early 90s. And Sony, for that matter, wasn't far off. All of that put Bandai CEO Makoto Yamashina, a man who considered his company a conventional toy maker at heart, in a really tricky spot. As it turns out, Yamashina was a fan of how easy Apple computers were to use, so he reached out to the company about teaming up to develop a sort of CD-based game console that could double as a home multimedia machine. Apple had just the thing, and after lots of back and forth, a deal was struck. Apple would handle the case design and logic board engineering, leaving manufacturing and literally everything else for Bandai to figure out. At some point along the way, someone at Apple went through a list of trademark names the company already owned and picked out Pippin, a strange choice, honestly, that reminds me more of Broadway than the Apple it was named after, but whatever. With a name and a plan, Apple announced Pippin in Japan at the end of December 1994, just 3 months after Bandai tried going it alone with a console of its own. So, what the hell was this thing? Let's start by getting our terms straight. Pippin wasn't a console, it was the platform itself, which was largely based on Apple's second-generation Power Macintoshes. Apple designed the Pippin to use 4x CD-ROM drives, 66 MHz PowerPC 603 processors, and 6 megs of RAM, all wrapped up in what I have to say is a pretty slick-looking design. You definitely couldn't say the same about some of the prototypes Apple worked up. The controller was fascinating too. Pippin was designed to play nice with 2 Applejack controllers, which look a lot like boomerangs with traditional controls, plus center-mounted trackballs so people could more easily interact with menus and on-screen elements. Now, one of the big draws of a platform like this is that developers who are already crafting games for the Mac could theoretically just tweak their work and create versions for Pippin consoles, but strangely, Pippin hardware didn't actually run Mac OS itself. It couldn't, since it didn't have a hard drive. Instead, the platform was designed to use a streamlined version of Apple's macOS 7.5.2 that was basically baked into each game disk, which, along with generally modest specs for the time, meant current Mac developers had to retool their games, in some cases pretty significantly, to run well on Pippin machines and the TVs they were connected to. The fact that Pippin consoles couldn't boot into any kind of operating environment might seem kind of weird, but to Apple, that was everything. The last thing they wanted was people thinking a Pippin console was a proper personal computer and buying one of those instead of a Mac. Now, that's Especially weird because the Pippin was designed to do something people had always relied on traditional computers to do: getting online. Now, this is where conflicting reports make the truth a little hard to suss out. Some report that Apple was behind the decision to add the modem to the Pippin platform, but in an interview with the journalist Richard Moss for his book, The Secret History of Mac Gaming, Eric Sirkin, who was then Apple's director of OEM products, strongly suggests that Apple kind of hated the idea. They thought the way to make money off the internet was going all in on subscription services like eWorld, which was basically Apple's attempt at competing with AOL. If it's starting to feel like no one had a really clear vision of what a Pippin console should be good at, you're definitely not alone. At one point, tight timelines forced 4 software engineers to go on strike, and Sirkin eventually had to fire them. It certainly didn't help that Michael Spindler, the man behind the Mac Clone Initiative, was replaced by a guy named Gil Amelio as Apple's 3rd CEO of the 90s. When Bandai received the final prototypes from Apple, they contracted Mitsubishi to manufacture the machines and started selling them under the name @Mark, like Shift 2 on your keyboard, @Mark. In Japan in March of 1996 for the equivalent of $620. Then, after delays and deliberation, Bandai brought the console to the United States in the form of the $500 all-black Bandai @World in December. The @Mark and @World were sort of like Macs, but not as functional, and they couldn't play games as well as its desktop counterparts. And like the @Mark, the @World's price was pretty much obscene by US gaming standards. It cost $200 more than Sony's PlayStation, and more than twice as much as the Nintendo 64 when that launched in the US. Poor sales right out of the gate were bad news for Bandai, but they were arguably worse for Apple. But by then, Apple was busy thinking about what came next, specifically a Pippin 2 platform with a faster processor, a DVD drive, 2D and 3D graphics acceleration, and support for cable modems. But none of that work ultimately mattered. Gil Amelio was Apple's CEO during Pippin 2 development, but he only lasted 500 days on the job. In September 1997, Steve Jobs finally returned to the company he helped create as interim CEO, and he killed Pippin, along with a slew of other projects that were kind of antithetical to his ideas.
You've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to try to sell it. And as we have tried to come up with a strategy and a vision for Apple, it started with what incredible benefits can we give to the customer? Where can we take the customer? Not starting with, let's sit down with the engineers and figure out what awesome technology we have, and then how are we going to market that?
After all of this, Apple steered clear of the living room for years, only for its next attempt to look kind of Pippin-like in hindsight. The original Apple TV, which was released in 2007, was basically a tiny underpowered Mac with a Pentium M chipset, a 40 gig hard drive, and NVIDIA GeForce graphics that you could really never, ever mistake for a full-blown computer, which sounds kind of familiar, right? 3 years later, Apple released an updated version that used the same processor as the iPhone 4, and we've been on that same course ever since. And that's the story of the Pippin. This is our first crack at a different kind of video for Engadget, where we take sort of long, hard looks at the moments and products and people that help shape the world we live in today, for better or worse. Honestly, the Pippin might have been a stretch in that regard, but we're kind of just feeling things out right now, and I've always really wanted to talk about it. If you have thoughts about the Pippin or how we approach this story, or if you have something you'd like us to cover this way, we'd love to hear about it. Leave your feedback below, and as always, thank you so much for watching. We appreciate the support, and we'll see you next time.
Licensing as fast as we can, flying off to Taiwan and Japan, showing them how to build a Mac copy, then we sell them all our hardware and our ROMs and System 7.